So what we will do is, first we will go through some of the ways in which the early novels had been highlighting the role of villages, and this we see in a particular way in Kanthapura, in an entirely different way in Waiting for the Mahatma. And later when we take a look at Untouchable, we will again see that the village setting plays an important role. So there are a number of critics who have located Waiting for the Mahatma as a sequel to Kanthapura, but one need not take that claim too seriously, because we really do not see many ways in which Waiting for the Mahatma could be seen as a continuation of the narration that we see in Kanthapura. Looking at the ways in which the village plays an important role. In fact, we realize that this is more, maybe most of these claims would be more appropriate when we talk about Kanthapura, but again we also have to keep in mind the fact that the same sort of reading has been extended to most of Narayan's works, but in a certain way again we can see that Waiting for the Mahatma is a different novel which really does not fall into all of these claims, all of these generalizations about the village. But nevertheless, it is important to know how the village has been generally located, especially in the early phase of Indian English fiction. There is an idealization of the village, and most of them they also present the village scene. Especially this is very evident in Kanthapura. It is like a real village. It's a fictional village, but somehow the rendition, the narrative techniques, the presentation of the characters, they all give us this impression that this is the authentic real village that you would find anywhere in India. It could be any other place. For the same reason, even this term Sthala Purana has been used extensively to talk about these sort of novels, and we know that Narayan's novels also, he created this fictional village called Malgudi, which is also presented again as an authentic, real kind of a village. And some of them also feel that this use of the village as the main setting for most of these Indian nationalist events or the early dilemmas of that the nation went through, the village provides an ideal setting to stage all of these concerns, these debates, etc., because it makes it possible to celebrate the immemorial values in a world of flux. Yeah, there are a number of things which would change. We would see that in with respect to the nation, with respect to the responses of the urban spaces to nation, to Gandhi, to colonialism, but village in certain ways remains very constant. Yeah? And in the values which are deeply entrenched in the village. Maybe in Kanthapura also this was initially seen as the way in which the novelists want to portray the village as a celebration of all those immemorial values. Maybe that was projected as a very positive thing, but looking back we can also see that that also had led to very deeply entrenched feelings about caste, about traditions, about reinforcing superstitions. Yeah. So somehow the village setting, somehow the role of Gandhi and the role of nationalist movement is superimposed into the village setting, which has been foregrounded in the novels. And we find a lot of use of myths, and again the myths also reiterate the permanence of certain values which are part of the village system. And we know that Gandhi also in multiple ways he highlighted the role of the village in sustaining Indian values, Indian tradition, that the root of everything Indian can be traced back to its villages, the need to preserve the villages in their pristine sense, so on and so forth. And in Rumina Sethi's work, Myths of the Nation, where she engages with Kanthapura, she talks about generally about how villages had been projected in the early novel. She talks about how the villages made it possible to talk about a truer and greater India which is timeless and enduring, and it also amounts to taking the romantic episteme from Orientalism for perceiving the village. She extends this argument further and says that most of the novels, she does not specifically talk about Waiting for the Mahatma, but most of the novels by Narayan as well as Kanthapura, they all talk about nationalism placed within the village setting, more or less a Orientalist rhetoric. She also argues that it would be perhaps impossible to differentiate the Orientalist rhetoric from that of the nationalist rhetoric, particularly when India is being projected, when the village purity is being projected as a as the ideal, as the exotic, as something timeless, as something which cannot undergo a change irrespective of what kind of attitudes are being superimposed onto the village. And she also finds this, very uncanny agreement between the Orientalist and nationalist accounts about the village setting in India. And she's also very critical about the way the freedom struggle is turned into a homogeneous national popular movement. While some of the critics are also of the opinion that Waiting for the Mahatma also does precisely that it also is a celebration, is a foregrounding of a homogeneous nationalist popular movement. We find that on a close reading, it actually critiques certain nuances which are part of the nationalist movement as well. It's not an entirely uncritical celebratory approach like that we would find in Kanthapura. Yeah? But again, we also need to be aware of the fact there are not too many works which eulogize Waiting for the Mahatma just the way they eulogize, say, a work like Kanthapura. Kanthapura assumes an iconic status in terms of a proper nationalist novel, a proper Gandhian novel, but Waiting for the Mahatma is always talked about as one of those novels where you also find nationalism being talked about, where Gandhi emerges as a character. But there is a certain refusal, except for a certain kind of a discussion in Priyamada Gopal's work, we do not find Waiting for the Mahatma occupying a central position among the other Gandhi novels of the post-independence period. And Rumina Sethi also says this about the village being the perfect site. The quest for identity had to be encoded in age-old principles ostensibly present in village societies that were accepted monuments of the essence of India. Such a representation oddly appeared to be the only means of countering the legacy of colonialism without actually engaging with any real ideological battle with the colonialists. Yeah? So, here it's also seen as an escapist sort of a narration without dealing with any sort of real ideological tussles which are going on, which are part of the pre-independence and the post-independence period. This sort of a setting allows the narrator, allows the author to talk about various aspects of the nationalism without really engaging with the ideological tussle, which is also a part of it. Again, in Waiting for the Mahatma, in fact, he does try to satirize some of the aspects of it about identity, about who belongs to India, about the ways in which there is not always entirely a change of heart when one decides to follow Gandhi. So, there are many ways in which Waiting for the Mahatma tries to challenge many of these dominant aspects related to nationalism. So, if we try to compare Waiting for the Mahatma and Kanthapura, yeah, so how would you respond to this claim by quite a number of critics who argue that this is similar to Kanthapura, that this is a sequel to Kanthapura? Can you begin to cite at least a couple of differences which would make Waiting for the Mahatma a very different kind of a novel from that of Kanthapura? Some of the things you started identifying from the previous session onwards.
This one is more character oriented. Waiting for Mahatma. Kanthapura is more like a history, regions, villages history. The characters are just tools. Are just tools to go on with the plot in Kanthapura. Yes. But Waiting for Mahatma, I think character is the central force. It's right. Not a tool.
Right. Right. Yeah. Any other thing?
Much like the last class, the central character Waiting for Mahatma is very human.
What do you think it prompted at least some of the critics to present Waiting for the Mahatma as a sequel?
Presence of Gandhi?
Could be the presence of Gandhi. Could be the nationalist movement at the background.
Village setting. The
village setting. Also, it could be that in Kanthapura there is an entire village which is waiting to be initiated into the Gandhian mode of living, the Gandhian mode of protest, the Gandhian anti-colonial struggle. But here we find a village which is more or less acquainted with this entire scenario. It's not as if it's just one character who is pursuing Gandhi. In the beginning, we even get this sense that unlike Kanthapura, there are a set of volunteers. Yeah, Gandhi is arriving, the village is getting ready, and we are looking at the novel, looking at the entire set of events through the eyes of the narrator, who is Sri Ram. Yeah, so maybe it's also seen as a sequel because there is a progress. Yeah, in the sense of there is a progressive way in which the village is more accepting in its attitude to Gandhism, in its attitude, in its responses to the nationalist movement. Yeah. So, but in that process of locating Waiting for the Mahatma as a sequel to Kanthapura, but they have also overlooked a number of things which make both of these novels a very distinct both of these novels as very distinct set of narratives. Yeah. And also what one tends to lose out when we see Waiting for the Mahatma as a sequel is the mild satire, humorous way of looking at the Gandhian ideology or nationalist movement. All of those things also we tend to miss out. Yeah. In fact, on the contrary, the way in which Waiting for the Mahatma deals with Gandhi has also been severely critiqued. Many have also been really appalled that how could Narayan, who is such a gentle soul, even write such a thing about Gandhi, without because there is no way in which this novel explicitly acknowledges the divine character of Gandhi. It does not talk about Gandhi as an infallible. Of course, you get a sense of that, but Sri Ram is very skeptical about his attitude in accepting Gandhi uncritically and unapologetically. Yeah.
I want to say something about the purpose of each novel.
Yeah.
I think one caters more to mass consciousness of the national movement, and the other is more for the individual reader. Also, that's reflected in the kind of the approach that the respective authors take towards the protagonist responding to the nationalist movement.
Yeah, in the same way, in fact, while Kanthapura talks about an entire village responding to the figure of Gandhi or the nationalist movement, here, though the entire village is there, we are more concerned about what Sri Ram goes through, which is why, a more human thing also comes out, because how an ordinary human being, an ordinary person who was living during that time, who has no overt sympathies for either side, how would such a person have responded to Gandhi at that point of time? But maybe a similar novel, if it had come out in the 30s or 40s, it would have been seen as very sacrilegious. Yeah, it may not really. It may also would be seen as a tool in the hands of the British. Narayan also has the advantage of hindsight. This is 1950s. Yeah, he's looking back at it and he's able to narrativize the historical period in a better way, if we like to put it that way. Yeah, and how would you see this contrast between the characters Murthy and Sri Ram? Do you think it's just because the novel was written in 1930s that Murthy emerged as a character? And had that novel also been written at a later point, would Murthy have transformed into a Sri Ram by then? One would know. I just want you to think about the material aspects of publishing, the date of publishing, the time when the novel was getting written. Did it have any bearing on the kind of characters that it produced? Yeah, and also Kanthapura versus Malgudi. Yeah, Yes, please, Ranjani.
I was thinking about how it would have not been, it would have been very premature for Murthy to, for instance, taken liking to a girl or something. So he's a bachelor also. Something like Gandhi would abandon himself to be his wife. So this is an all new inversion of that thing where he actually begins to induct himself to the nationalist movement because of a girl. So it's a little progressive.
Little?
Progressive in that sense.
Yeah, and also this is not an, we find that if you do a close reading of the novel, which is not really been undertaken in a serious way, because most of them they try to locate this as a sequel of Kanthapura, we can actually see that this goes against the grain of many things that Gandhi and nationalist movement talk about. And even when it seems to toe the line, there is always this skepticism, or there is some way in which counter view is also being raised. Yeah. In terms of it's not as if it's very radical in the sense that it talks about caste, it talks about gender, not much of a discussion of the alternate histories and the alternate voices which were prevalent then, but nevertheless compared to the other set of Gandhi novels which are available to us, this is the only one which dares to even talk about these things in a mocking tone, in an almost satirical tone. Yeah? And how about Kanthapura and Malgudi? Both are fictional villages.
Constructed or written about especially for the novel, and Malgudi has a whole series behind it and after it, which I think is seen in the difference. In Waiting for the Mahatma, the nationalist movement is not, as we discussed, it's not the main focus. Shriram had a life before that, and he will continue to have a life after that, and things stay the same in the village up to a certain extent. But in Kanthapura, it is building up to, it builds up to the nationalist movement and to the fight or the riot that happens in the end, and the entire village is destroyed.
Yeah, it's almost as if there is no unique story for Kanthapura unless it's associated with nationalism. At least we are not being given that impression. Yeah? And the figure of Gandhi that we also discussed in the previous session, how the figure of Gandhi is very symbolic in Kanthapura, but in Waiting for the Mahatma, he emerges as a real character. But again, he is not the major character. Yeah? He is the major character historically, but the narrative allows Shriram to continue as a central character from the beginning till the end. Yeah? And one of the critics have pointed out that Kanthapura anchors a politico-religious within a distantiated ethnography vis-a-vis Waiting for the Mahatma. Yeah? So, maybe it's also because the setting in Kanthapura, the narrative in Kanthapura does not allow us to go into the inner lives of, or even other lives of the villagers outside the setting of nationalist movement, yeah, outside their engagement with Murthy. Murthy and Gandhi are such towering figures that every character is described in connection with how they respond to Gandhi or how they respond to the nationalist movement. But in Waiting for the Mahatma, there are also characters who are completely ignorant of what Gandhi is doing, completely indifferent to what Gandhi is doing. We also get a sense that it is possible to live an ordinary, mundane, safe, happy life without really being conscious about all of these things. In multiple ways, we can say that Kanthapura and Waiting for the Mahatma, they are not talking about the same kind of village settings. Yeah? And also, this is not the same Malgudi that Narayan had introduced to us in his other novels, yeah, which is why this again stands out. Yeah, this is a Malgudi which he uses to access the nationalist movement satirically as well. There is a way in which the novel does not always look, the village does not always look inwardly, but it also looks outside to critique and to comment on the overarching influence of the nationalist movement. This is something that I also draw from Priyamvada Gopal's work. Waiting for the Mahatma is more laconic about the Gandhian phenomenon compared to the seriousness in Kanthapura. There is a deliberate attempt that Waiting for the Mahatma does to not assume a serious tone throughout. This could be seen in a number of instances from the beginning till the end, where Shriram is always having these thoughts. He is always, even when he is engaging with very, very serious thing, when he is listening to Gandhi's talk, there is another conversation which is going on his head. Yeah. So, in that way, novel is deliberately trying not to be serious. Yeah. And about Gandhi's historical personage and how that gets used in the novel in a very different way, and Narayan's trivialization of Gandhianism through comic irony. So, what do you think is the purpose of that? He does trivialize certain things that Gandhi talks about. And that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, has been criticized by many. The bantering tone was not found very, many were not too appreciative about Narayan using such a tone. Yeah? And maybe for the same reason, it also had led to two different camps when it comes to the critical appreciation of this novel. One which argued that this was not wholly a success, and the other set of people who argued that this is far more effective than the staged debate in Untouchable. And Kanthapura and Untouchable in that sense have also been seen as not so authentic, yeah, in terms of that there is a deliberate attempt to focus on certain aspects, and it looked very staged, very artificial. The kind of the kind of naturality which we can find in Waiting for the Mahatma, many also feel is missing in the other works. Maybe when we take a look at Untouchable, there also Gandhi is a central figure in a very different way, yeah, because if you look at Kanthapura, the narrator is the central character is Murthy and the narrator is a woman. In Waiting for the Mahatma, the story is about Sri Ram. We get to know about everything through Sri Ram's eyes. When it comes to Untouchable, the central character and the narrator both are the same. It's an untouchable figure, Baka. Yeah. So, in all of these novels, Gandhi is there as a figure, either entering the novel directly or entering the novel through the lens of the narrators and the central protagonists. Yeah. So, if you take a comparison, again we may begin to feel that Waiting for the Mahatma has a more human approach, a more realistic approach. There is a more critical way of engaging with Gandhi as a real person than any kind of a symbolic presentation or a mythical divine quality being attributed to Gandhi. So, here we also find a romantic angle being included into the novel, which also makes it a very different novel from the other Mahatma novels, other Gandhi novels. There is an unfolding of a private, which is a secular and a depoliticized world, and this is combined with a romantic Bildungsroman. Yeah? And Sri Ram, in that sense, is the novel's struggling everyman. It could be any ordinary person like Sri Ram, who's been living a rather uneventful life even in the wake of this period of high nationalism. And Bharati allegorizes the nation, as the novel explicitly tells us as well, and it also talks about the middle class romantic love. And here we find a subtle interrogation of political virtue and religious leadership, no uncritical acceptance of these values over here. And time and again many have stressed upon the novel's value in such a way that it talks about Gandhi's impact on ordinary people. And this is again something which began to be examined in, say, historiography in general only from the, say, 70s and 80s onwards. Until that time, Gandhi was seen as the major leader. There were other figures who also had assumed the leadership position regionally, nationally. So, the nationalist discussion was mostly centered around those set of people. From the 70s and 80s onwards, with the advent of subaltern studies, with this need to critique nationalist historiography, we begin to see a number of writings coming up questioning Gandhi's impact on ordinary people. So, in that sense, maybe the novel Waiting for the Mahatma was not accepted wholly, was not considered like not considered as wholly a success in the 1950s, because it was a little too early to talk about Gandhi in such a way. Yeah, it was a little too early to talk to view Gandhian impact with a bit of suspicion, yeah, because the novel in fact resonates more with many of the retellings of the nationalist historiography from the 70s and 80s onwards. In that sense, it also stands out as a very different sort of we can neither fit it into the 30s, 40s setting, and 50s, 60s, when many other novelists are talking about the domestic struggles, the internal struggles, the tradition modernity dilemma. Here is someone who is challenging the nationalist framework altogether, the nationalist historiography altogether. Maybe this sort of inability to fit in the novel to any of those frameworks must have led to this critical neglect which we could see in terms of the novel. Priyamada Gopal makes this argument that there is a possibility that Gandhism might have an oppressive side, and this has been engaged by the novel. Can you think of any instance? Do you find Gandhi being an authoritarian at any point? Does Sri Ram feel that at any point that he is doing things just because Gandhi is saying? He's not even sure whether he should be doing that or not. Can you think of a couple of instances for that?
There is one instance when Bharati sends a letter to Gandhi to seek his permission for the marriage.
Yeah.
And Gandhi says no, not yet. So I think that's a instance when Sri Ram had to do something because of Gandhi's will.
Is it Gandhi who is the connecting thread from the beginning to the end of the novel, or is it Bharati?
It's hard to say.
Huh?
It's hard to say.
Towards the end, when the permission for the marriage is like again sought, in a moment of desperation, we even find him saying, yeah, this is in this book, it's page 252. Yeah, Mahatma ji looked from one to the other with joy. Do you like each other so much? Sri Ram burst out. I've waited for 5 years thinking of nothing else. Yeah. And after he comes out of the jail, after the moment of independence has been achieved, this is the only thing which continues to hold his passions very strongly. So, is it Bharati or is it Gandhi? Yeah. Did he just stray into this entire movement? In between, again, we find a different streak of his personality coming out during his encounter with Jagadish. Yeah, he's glad that he's met somebody who is not entitled, because he was also a little claustrophobic throughout. He always had this internal dialogues in his mind. Every moment, he comes across those Swayam Sevaks or the ones who are the volunteers of Gandhi. When Gandhi is speaking, he knows that he is compelled to listen to all of these things, but that sort of a passion was not there at all. Do you think he is more perhaps, though he also is disillusioned with whatever happens with after his encounter with Jagadish, but do you think he resonates more with Subhash Chandra Bose than with Gandhi?
A very boyish side to him, where the glamour and the adventure of things boys do in storybooks and hero stories, where you go around derailing trains and setting off possible bombs. This type of adventures are made up as one of the possibly why he gets something.
Yeah, extending that argument, would it be fair to say that Kanthapura's Murthy is a more mature character, sorted, yeah? And this is an immature character who's just dallying with different phases of nationalist movement, not really convinced about anything. Yeah, just a phase in his life. He's like the novel begins in the early 20s and it is over before he crosses a certain period of his life. It's like just the early 20s still. Yeah. So do you think it's also talking about a certain kind of a dalliance with nationalist movement? Is Narayan also trying to tell us that maybe a number of them had only that sort of a dalliance with the nationalist movement, which is why post-independence we do not see a resonation of many of those things happening. This is 1950s. 1960s we see the peak of disillusionment with the nationalist, post-nationalist phase entirely. And from 70s and 80s we know we do not get the same sort of a celebratory rhetoric. Forget about Gandhi, not even about the nation. The entire narrative, not just fictionally, historically and politically, we do find a very different sort of a rhetoric emerging. Yeah? So, it's at some level, it's a deliberate thing that Narayan does by giving us a very immature character, yeah? Who is very unsure of himself. Yeah, who is who's ready to take seemingly ready to take all kinds of risks, yeah, and but not really fully prepared for that, yeah, who's clueless about his own life, yeah. And Bharati on the other hand, we do not get much insights about her character, but Bharati on the other hand is like is like a girl who is best suited for say Murthy, yeah, quite sorted. Yeah, she knows what she wants. She says she knows how to say the right things at the right time. On the other hand, Sri Ram thinks he has this need to get train himself to talk in that kind of a language. We'll also take a look at some of those instances. And about his didactic patriotism. Patriotism needs to be. He learns patriotism, and he also thinks it should be taught to anyone whom he meets. he fails miserably in that. Yeah, he gets lost in his own arguments. Yeah, and he doesn't know how to go about it. Again, after the Gandhi phase, when he meets Jagadish, the same sort of a thing. He wants to first get tutored in those. He wants to get the grammar right of how to talk to certain kind of people, what would please them. A very immature character, which also gives the novelist a lot of room to explore, to satirize, allow him to be skeptical. And this question about who is an Indian and who is the one who needs to be liberated from what, yeah, that is being asked many times in the novel, though not very directly. And even Sri Ram was not under any bondage. Yeah, when the novel begins, it begins on a very happy note. Yeah, he is an orphan, but it's not as if he doesn't have anybody in life. He is happy with his own life. He has not really faced any sort of difficulty in his life, and even during the course of the novel, he is fortunate to have been part of a privileged position. Yeah, and there's a way in which he needs to consciously tell himself and others that we have to be part of the struggle. But even towards the end of the novel, one is not too sure whether he is really convinced about it. You remember that brief episode in between about there's this character who is quite adamant about the fact that I don't want the British to go. If the British leave, what will we do now? Now is not the time. We are not yet ready to rule ourselves. Yeah. So all of those debates are also being built into this through the immaturity and naivety of this character. We'll go through some of the, very quickly go through some of the episodes of the novel, and from the beginning in fact. And right at the outset we get to know about Sri Ram celebrating his 20th birthday. Yeah, that's in this book, it's then page 9. So we also get to know that he's a very young boy, early 20s. Yeah, and page 24. Sri Ram suddenly woke from an age-old somnolence to the fact that Malgudi was about to have the honor of receiving Mahatma Gandhi. Yeah, so the narration that he gives, it's also it's all of these things that all the things that he received from hearsay is being retold to the or to the audience as well. Yeah, and he is also ready to wait for Mahatma, and there in page 25, waiting for the Mahatma makes one very thirsty. Yeah, so he is trying to think about very profound things, but he can only present them in a profound way, but the thought remains very base throughout. Yeah, this we see from the beginning till the end of the novel. It also brings us to the question whether he really underwent a change of heart or not. Come to page 32, where Gandhi is giving this spectacular speech. He talks about it's not enough for you to clap your hands and show your appreciation. He talks about love in between. He says towards the end, be sure to have in your heart love and not bitterness. And Sri Ram, yeah, definitely it's not bitterness, I love her. But Mahatma Ji is saying, if I have the slightest suspicion that your heart is not pure, that there is bitterness there, I'd rather have the British stay on. It's the lesser of two evils. And Sri Ram is on a different trip altogether. Oh, Reverend Mahatma Ji, have no doubt that my heart is pure and without bitterness. How can I have any bitterness in my heart for a creature who looks so divine? Yeah. So throughout this thing, Gandhi is talking about one thing, and all he can think about is Bharati. At a later point, when Jagadish begins to talk, the first thing, why does he befriend Jagadish in the first place? Because Jagadish also was a friend of Bharati, and there is a sense of competition, a sense of rivalry in his mind. Yeah, did she ever consider marrying Jagadish? Yeah, so it's from the beginning till the end, we do not find him really getting out of those very immature, mundane concerns that he has about himself and about life in general. And
One doubt was, do you think it also talks about whether nationalism can be cultivated or whether it's just an inherent thing? Because it seems like an artificial attempt in some places to appear patriotic.
Yes.
Whereas
Yes.
Murthy has that inbuilt quality of.
What do you think? What do you think about that?
I just comment.
I think it has a lot to do with the upbringing of the person.
That's very profound again. Yeah. Could you just elaborate, Kinshuk, what do you mean by upbringing?
I think the way you are the way you are born and brought up in a particular family, and your exposure to certain things can determine if you are a person who thinks of nation or not in a particular way.
Okay. So you mean to say that one needs to be taught to be patriotic
I think so.
from
Yeah.
the younger days onwards, like
Yeah.
it's been taught?
Yeah.
Patriotism. What do you think? Have we been taught patriotism or not?
More or less, yes, like not always
Yes,
advertently.
think about
but-
your school days. Yeah, what was the one thing that you sang every day, like for about 10 years of your life?
And that too not correctly.
Yeah, what was the one pledge? Is there any other pledge that you've repeated and you are not going to repeat any other pledge ever? What was the only thing that you repeated, like, and even today, the moment, these sort of things are being sung, yeah, you suddenly feel this, the momentary surge of patriotism, yeah, and then, yeah, it just dies off, yeah. And when you see the flag, yeah, you in this sense, I'm not talking about like you, yeah, generally, yeah. So at some level, I think Narayan is also a little too early in critiquing that, the way in which this has been cultivated. This section, this is page 73 by my book, where he talks about, he's thinking to himself about luxuries, yeah, because Bharati tells Sri Ram, you just better get used to, these sort of things, you will not have any comforts, we are trained to live like this. And he's thinking, there was a class of society where luxuries gave one a status, and now here was the opposite. The more one asserted one cared for no luxury, the more one showered an inclination for hardship and discomfort, the greater was one's chance of being admitted into the fold. Yeah, as if he's telling himself, I should learn the tricks of the trade. Yeah, how to get into this cult. Yeah, Sri Ram had understood it the moment he stepped into the camp. Here the currency was suffering and self-mortification. Everyone seemed to excel his neighbor in managing in uncomfortable situations, and Sri Ram caught the spirit, though it took him some time to grasp the detail and get accustomed to it. Yeah, he's telling us the novel through the novel. Sri Ram from the beginning till the end is he's trying to tutor himself. Yeah, and also he's very acutely conscious of displaying the right kind of behavior, the right kind of patriotic behavior. Yeah. So, did you think it's a case even today?
There is always a question of right patriotism,
Right
right
patriotism.
nationalism, and what is not right.
Yeah, it's the same dichotomy can be seen over here. The Gandhian kind of nationalism is the right nationalism. Yeah, but the moment you talk about what was Subhash Chandra Bose talking about, he did not say succumb to the British. He also said the same thing. He also said, yeah, please kick them out. Let's rule ourselves. Yeah, but that is seen as a bad nationalism. He is not. He's scared to listen to the radio. He cannot talk about that. But on the contrary, Gandhism is something that he can really flaunt. Yeah, but the other association is not something that he also knows that he likes it, but he knows that he cannot he cannot flaunt it in any way. Yeah, so yeah, of course these are also like certain criticisms which are historically undertaken at a later period, later point of time. Yeah, and at that time again the novel fails to get any sort of a recognition. Yeah, because it was predated. Yeah, it came out in 1950s, and we do not find people going back to it in the 1980s. But this question, in fact, it is certainly interesting about whether patriotism can be taught, or is it like one needs to be born with it, or are there certain privileges associated with it that you should be able to afford to be able to own it. Yeah, these are again certain questions which particularly the post 80s novels would again ask. And this page 109, Sri Ram said, you are no doubt making a lot of money, but it is worth nothing unless you develop some spirit of, he fumbled for words. He wanted to say national service or patriotism, but he was tired of these expressions. They smacked of platform speeches. Yeah, that's what he thinks about these terms, about patriotism and about national service. But he also knows this is the right thing. And then he says, you know, if you have a photo of Mahatma Gandhi, pray that he may inspire you with reasonable thinking. That's all I can say. Yeah. Then he got up abruptly to leave. Yeah. And it's after that, you know, he's writing Quit India, and there's this man who comes and asks, what is the use of writing Quit India in all these places? Do you want us to quit? Yeah. So he's actually trying to be part of the nationalist movement. He is also making a lot of blunders along the line. He feels, but it does not mean that. Then write it where it can be seen by those for whom it is meant. They are everywhere, sometimes seen and sometimes unseen. It is better to have it written everywhere. Waste of time and paint, said the man. I am merely carrying out an order, and I cannot afford to stop and listen to too much wisdom. Yeah. So this sort of a quarrel is there throughout in his mind, and whenever somebody asks a question, he gets very defensive. Yeah. It's not as if, you know, because he gets defensive because he's also answering himself perhaps. Yeah. The same sort of a doubt somebody else is asked, maybe he also has the same sort of things. Why do we have to write Quit India everywhere? If you think about it, you know, like you just write Quit India everywhere, it's not as if, oh, quit India, okay, let's quit. Yeah. Doesn't work that way. Yeah. And also about some of the absurdities which are associated with these ritualistic depiction of patriotism. Yeah. And the other instance is, will you marry me after we are out of all this? Will you promise if Bapuji permits? Yeah. This is like halfway through the novel. Yeah. And these are some of the very earnest, true things that Sri Ram seems to say, yeah, without, you know, thinking twice about this, if this is the right way to talk. Yeah. And yes, I promise, she said, and hurried off before he could talk to her or follow her. Yeah. And he stood where he was and saw her raising her hands to her eyes once or twice in order to wipe off the tears gathering there. Yeah. We also get this feeling that even Bharati is not really allowed to be herself. Yeah. There is this, overarching presence of Gandhi, more than the presence of Gandhi. I think the struggle is internally as well. Yeah. Would I be betraying myself if I am truer to my own cause than to the nation's cause, than to the cause of nationalism? Yeah. And from part 3 of the novel, you know, it's a different journey altogether, with Jagadish entering the scene, and this these repeated broadcasts from Tokyo, Subhash Chandra Bose talking, and this is after he gets imprisoned. There's a place when he encounters another person who is very indifferent towards this entire movement. Sri Ram wanted to speak to them about politics. This is page 197 in my book. Sri Ram wanted to speak to them about politics, Mahatma ji and non-violence, and the British rule. He began to speak, but he was cut short by the man saying, who cares who rules? We don't belong to that world. I've seen all those Gandhi followers in prison, and they think they are honoured guests. If you had been careful, you could have enjoyed that too. They would have put you in a bungalow with a cook and pocket money, and they would have given you books to read and sharbat to drink. Yeah. So because he is not a Gandhian prisoner, Sri Ram is not a Gandhian prisoner when he reaches the prison. So here we are also shown this difference between the nationalist prisoners and the other prisoners who were also arguably fighting the British. Yeah. And look at the sarcasm and the indifference which is being shown over here, which is like true as well. The political prisoners were treated differently when they came out of the jail after independence. They continued to be treated in a different way. Yeah. But it took a while, perhaps, again, this sort of a thing can be written only in the 50s or later on. Yeah. Because that was the generation which began to see, in some cases, even the true colors of those, yeah, who were fighting for the nationalist cause. Yeah. And Sri Ram's blood boiled at his words, how dare you speak like that, but he wants to get up and hit that man and all, but he also knows in his heart that that is the truth of the matter. And about Independence Day, we ought to rejoice that it's our own people that are blundering. Isn't that so? Sri Ram asked, some of his irresponsible spirit returning. Fancy Nehru and Patel and the rest sitting there where there were haughty viceroys before. Didn't Churchill call Mahatma ji the naked fakir? The naked fakir is everything now. Think of it. He was excited. There are bound to be mistakes, bound to be blunders everywhere, but we must not make much of them. He was wildly incoherent and happy. If you had been out of jail, you would have been garlanded and carried in a procession on Independence Day. What a pity you missed it. It was a grand affair. Yeah. So it's also about, not just about Sri Ram. Maybe a number of such people, who were waiting for that day, and when that day came, they just hearing reports from others, or maybe it's not even such a major event when independence actually happens. And in the 70s and 80s, we also see in various other accounts about how disillusioned the entire nation was with that event happening, because it was not just about independence, it was also about a set of new struggles which began after the nation was born. And about 227, after all, as you said, we are an infant nation. The word was very convincing. It had a homely and agreeable sound. Nobody need worry what it meant or why it was mentioned. He's trying to be very joyful at the occasion, but he's not able to bring himself to this mood of celebration. There is even some regret in his in his approach. Yeah, so it's a very different, a very ambivalent situation in the post-independence period. And now I'm coming to the end of the novel when he's traveling in train. Yeah, he's out of jail. He's traveling in train. I remember that scene where Sri Ram understood that the intruders were men looking for Muslims in the compartment. If Muslims were found, they would be thrown out of the moving train, an echo of the fighting going on in other parts of the country. Sri Ram lapsed into silence for the rest of the journey. It was a most uncomfortable journey. Yeah? So we are also being told very indirectly about the communal rights which have set in, about how he escapes narrowly because he's a Hindu and not a Muslim. The novel does not dwell much into it, but it's a very telling statement over here. Sri Ram felt more uncomfortable here than he had felt in the prison. Yeah? So we do not find him joyful except towards the end when he is finally united with Bharati, and this is towards the end. Yeah, about Mahatma ji talking about she'd be a very unbecoming bride who spoke her mind aloud, God bless you when there's a happy occasion, yeah, and all of this. And towards the end, what happens towards the end of the novel? What's the final scene?
Gandhi was shot dead.
Right. So in the same, in the same chapter where he is united with Bharati, Gandhi is shot dead by, there is this, I'll just read out the last bit. The man tried to step forward again. Mahatma ji's granddaughter said, take your seat, and tried to push him into the line. The man nearly knocked the girl down and took a revolver out of his pocket. As the Mahatma was about to step on the dais, the man took aim and fired. 2 more shots rang out. The Mahatma fell on the dais. He was dead in a few seconds. Yeah. So we have absolutely no way of knowing what Sri Ram felt after this. Yeah. There is his commentary, his internal thoughts end much before that, because the last thing that they tell each other, like Bharati and Sri Ram, they decide to attend the prayer. There is place for 2 of us. They stepped aside. Yeah. So it ends on a very ambiguous note as well. We have no way of knowing what happened to Sri Ram after this, or do you think he was just left a disillusioned man? Did he move further away from this cause after this, or does he take charge and assume leadership? Very unlikely. Yeah? We have no way of knowing either. Why do you think the novel ends like this?
Because I think it's a way of telling how convincing we were talking about nationalism and all. We were talking about it is inherent or forced, or not forced, teaching how to teach the nationalism. In the end, it seems like it's kind of telling how convincing it can be, even if it's Gandhi or someone so you have, in one way you have inherent one, let us say, and some other one, how can you convince, how effective it can be. So it's kind of intriguing, can it be or can it not?
Right. Also, at the risk of sounding very blasphemous, does Sri Ram even think, good riddance, what if the man continues to dictate? Yeah, he's just been united with Bharati. One doesn't know. Yeah? So, yeah, what do you think about the novel? Readable novel, right? Yeah, please read it before your mid-sem. We will have questions from Kanthapura and from this. Yeah. Okay, so see you on Monday. Thanks for coming.